Hello and welcome again to the channel. I'm your host Bill. In this video tutorial, we're looking at how to test a Node.js application. We will discuss things like unit testing, integration testing, end-to-end testing, and we'll talk a little bit about performance testing. Without too much chit chat, let's hop in and let's get cracking. So testing an application is one of those interesting topics when it comes to development. You even have a paradigm, which is test-driven approach, which basically means that before developing your application, you want to see how things should work. So in Node.js, JavaScript, and every other language that you look at, you have a series or types of testing that you might want to perform on your application. So you have things like unit testing, which basically is you're testing individual functions or components in isolation. This will involve testing things like utility functions or service methods. Now, you have integration testing, which is basically testing how different parts of the application work together. This will involve things like testing API endpoints with real database. In our case, you might be doing some mock, but we'll look at that. So another type of testing that you would probably see when you're developing an application is end-to-end testing, which basically is testing an entire application flow, doing things like simulating user interactions, like when a user clicks on a button, you test that entire flow, basically end-to-end. This will involve things like testing your login, testing, your logout, those sort of things, and also testing CRUD applications through an API. So the last part of testing is mostly what we call performance testing. Let's say you have an application and you're expecting to have 1 million users in your application, and at a specific time during the day, you have, say, let's say 300,000 people making requests to your API. So you would want to test how your application behaves when you have that amount of load. That is what is considered as performance testing. So we're going to go ahead and set up our test environment and we'll see what that looks like. We'll run a couple of tests. So currently, let me get rid of these, and let's no. And our current structure is that we have our source folder. If you look at the notes here, I have installed a couple of packages. So we're going to be using mongodb-server, Mongo's Jest, and we'll be using Jest. So we'll be using Jest to test API endpoints, and we're using Jest for testing functions. At the moment, we have a file which we're exporting users. Keep in mind that we're using the common JS module system because if I wanted to use the module or ES module, I had to do some configurations with, which I was like, I'm lazy, don't want to spend time to do that. So in here, we're exporting these users, and into our math function, we have a basic function that adds two numbers. And we have a server, which we have a basic API endpoint here. We'll test it just in a moment. And then we have our setup DB, which is basically what we're going to use when we are testing our modules or our backend. So you have a before all and after all, which basically this part of the function will be run before every test, creating the connection to that in-memory Mongo server. And then once you finish every test, we want to close that connection and drop every database that could have been created. And then we have our user module, which basically uses Mongoose. It basically creates a schema and exports a module. And then we have our user server, which basically uses our dummy data here. So if I bring this upwards, right, and let's put this here. So when you're looking at test cases, you have test suites and you have test cases. So in this case, we're going to say describe, which is an utility function exported by Jest. And then we're going to describe add, this should be add function. So this basically says what we want to test. And then this receives a callback function. And inside here, we can now define our test cases. You can use it or test, but in this particular case, we're going to be using it. And then what we want to test is that our add function should add two numbers correctly. This message doesn't have to be this. It can be whatever you want, but this should basically describe the test case. So it receives a callback function, and in here we want to test a couple of things, right? We want to say const expected. We can say expected value is equals to 5. We want to add 2 and 3, and we expect that the result of that should be 5. So once we have that, we now say const actual value is going to be equals to, we call our add function and we pass it 2 and 3. Now we expect that if we add 2 and 3, the result should end up being 5. And then we now specifying what is our actual value. So this is what it means to actually write test. And then Jest also exports an utility function called expect. And then we say that we expect our actual value dot to be, so it changes those functions to be our expected value. Now let's do an npm run test just to see how that looks like. So if you look now, ignore the errors that we have where we are testing this particular part. So this is a part that we are interested in. So it tells you that test suite 1 pass and 1 test pass. So this passed. Now, if you change this to say 4 and you do an npm run test, it is going to fail, and it's going to basically tell you it was expecting a 5, but it was expecting a 4, but actually got a 5, which means that we added 2 and 3, so that the value that we received was actually 5, but what it was actually expecting was this. So let's write the next test. Let's scroll down. I don't know if I should make this bigger. Let's make it bigger a little bit just to see how that looks. Also, let's make it bigger, yeah? And then let's push this a little bit to the side. So our next test we're looking at, we'll say it, and we say adds negative numbers correctly. Okay. Now, if you look in our test here, it will tell you at some point which test failed or which test passed. So normally, if you add -1 and -3, you should get -4, right? So that's what we're trying to test in this particular instance. So this also receives a callback function as we saw earlier. And instead of saying expected value, we're just going to say expected, so that we spend less time typing because we're actually very lazy. And then we'll say const actual. Now, naming these variables is optional. You can actually just run it internally. So if you do not want to write out this function, which I would recommend that you do, you can just say expect. You expect -4.2b, and then you call the add function and you pass in -1 and -3. Now, -1 and -3 is up to you. You can decide to pass in -2 and -2, but the idea is that you're trying to see that if you add 2 negative numbers, it will add up to a number that you expect it to be. So we're going to do an npm run test, and this should give us, okay, we have a failed value here, and let's see what the error is. Okay, we did not change this. Okay, so let's change this back to 5. So that's actually what was failing. So it runs the test sequentially. So now we have 2 tests passed, and if you come here, it's going to tell you that so pass, it will tell you this pass. Now ignore this error here because we can. So I think let's get rid of these files. We'll create them. Let's get rid of these files just so that we have a clean test here. So if you run that, you see that we have add function should add 2 numbers correctly, and we have those 2 tests passed. So we have 1 test suite and we have 2 test cases. So that should be it for our add method. Let's go ahead and test our server. So we're going to create a new test, and we'll call that supertest.js. And then what we're going to do is that we are going to create our imports at the top. And then what we want to do is we want to test a series of cases, right? And what we want to do is that we want to test a series of cases. So let's just go ahead and do a describe. We've seen this before already. And we say we want to do the get, and we want to test the users. So let's put this, this should be a string that receives a callback function. And then we said it, we can use test as well. Okay, so this is a test case. And then we say should return a list of users. So we already have our expected value. So because we're going to be calling a wait function in here, we're going to use passing an async callback function. And in here, we'll say const response is equals to a wait. Now we have our request here, which we get from Supertest, which is used for making mock API calls. So we'll say request, and it takes in the app, which is what we exported in our server.js. So we exported the app here. That's what we're using at the moment. And then we now make a .get request. And the API endpoint we're looking at targeting is the user's endpoint, right? And then we now say that we expect, now the expectation is that when we run that, we expect the response.status to be 200. Now, if we get into our server here and we make, based on this, you see that if we get the proper response, we set the status to 200 and we return that list of users, right? Which is basically what we get from our data here. Now, let's close this out. And if we run our test, that should hopefully pass as well. So it says cannot find module server. I think that's because we have two dots here. Let's get rid of that because we're not moving one folder back. So we're in the same folder structure. So let's go ahead and run our test one more time. So npm run test, and that should pass. So we can see that our test suits passed properly. Now, inside this particular function, we also expect a body, right? So we can say we expect our response.body dot to equal, and we expect it to return our list of users. So let's go ahead and run that test one more time, and that should pass as well. So it considers all of these as a single test. But if any one of these tests fails, it will consider this particular test is to have failed. The next one that we might want to do is we'll say describe, and we'll say we want to test the get, and that will be the users ID, and then that should take a callback function, and then we do an eat, and we say should return a first item, pardon my French, of users. So should return there, not a. That is not important, but well, I don't want someone saying, oh, you can't speak English. So this is going to receive an async callback function. And inside here, we want to basically say const response is equals to await request, and then we pass in the app, and then we say dot get. And now what we do is that we're going to use the backtick, which means we want to do string incorporation. Look that up, and then we say users, and we want to look at an endpoint, and then we want to pass in a user ID of 1. Now, if we look at our our data structure, we have an ID of 1. And if we look at our user service, we actually pass in the ID, and then we do a find, and we try to get a user based on that ID. So that should hopefully return first user of that list. So if we call this function, for instance, the next one to look at, we will say, obviously, we expect our response, the state use. So let's perform this same test here. So we expect that to be 200, and then we also expect our response.body to equal, and then we have a users list, and we expect it to be the item at the first index, right? So let's do an npm run test. That should pass. So we have 4 tests pass, and then we have that. Now, what I want you to do is that I want you to create a test to see if you get a 404 or a 400, which means that create a test where you pass in an ID of 10, 15, 100, and then you check for the status of 400, and then ensure that you get a success failed error message. So basically, I want you to test to see that when you call this server, if you pass in a false ID, get a status of 400, and then you should get the body to be this. Now, let's go on to work on the next test. I am trying to be as fast as possible because obviously people want short videos. So the next test that we're going to do is, okay, let's bring this, for some reason we created that outside here. Let's bring this into the test, right? So normally, yes, we'll go through the entire folder structure and try to ensure that it's actually importing the right things. And that is the reason why we had that error where we had that error with the folder structure. So because we've moved that up, let's see if our test still runs properly. And that fails because obviously we've moved the test up, and it's saying that I couldn't find that specific module. So let's save this and run the test one more time because this has been updated, so everything passes properly. The next thing we want to do is that we want to test our module, right? So inside our user test module, what we're going to do is let's just go ahead and import the user. So importing the user module, and then we're doing this particular setup. which basically creates a link to the mongodb in-memory server, and then after every test, it closes that. So let's close this, and then let's come in here. And what we'll do is that we'll just do one test. You can go ahead and test other things, like you can test things like put, create, you can modify an object and see how you can play around with that, right? So in this case here, we're going to just do a user module test, and then this should receive, this should receive a callback function as usual. And then we're going to create our test case, and we say should create and fetch a user, right? So this is what we want to test. And this should receive an async callback function, because we're going to be using async await insert here. And it will say const user is equals to new user, which is our user model that we did create. And then we're going to pass in an object of name as we expect. And we're going to say, let's just call the name Bill, right? Capital letters. And then we'll say email, and then let's just give an admin@mail.com, right? So this is the user that we're trying to create. And then what we do is an await user. So once you create a model, it now offers you to gives you access to utility functions as well. This is Mongo's. I probably will make a video on that, but for now, let's just use that. So we say user.save. This will save the user to the DB, right? So we want to check that that has been saved, right? So we now say const found user. Let's make that let's make that a single word. Is equals to await, and then we say the user module, which is user dot find one, and this takes in some search options, and we want to find the user based on its email, and which was admin@mail.com, right? We are going to try to fail the test, but let's just pass in the correct test. So what we do is that we expect the found user.name .to be. We expect it to be, say, let's put in a false value, right? So we expect it to be Yengo, for instance. Now, if we run this test, we should get a failed test because we're passing the wrong value, right? So you see that it says that we expect Yengo, but we received Bill. And now if we change this to Bill, for instance, right, our test should pass as expected. So we have all the tests passed. So the last test that we would want to create is, let's go ahead and say new file, and we want to test the user service .test.js. So this is a test. We want to test our user service, right? So let's go ahead and import a couple of utility functions that we need. So what we want to do is we want to create a mock, right? So we say yes.mock, and we want to mock the user service, right? So what we do is that we go one folder back, and then this takes in a callback function, and we should return an object. So when you return an object with JavaScript, you use the, well, you know what that means. Yeah, and then we want to mock the user service. And what we want to do is that if we get into user service, we want to mock the fetch users and the fetch user by ID. So what we want to do is that we say we want to mock this, and then we use the Jest.fn, which is a function. And then the other function that we want to test is, okay, let's just copy this. Okay, I'm actually don't want to waste time typing, so we want to mock this as well. And then we say yes.fn. Now you can go to the documentation of Yes, just play around with it and actually get a deep dive understanding of what we're actually doing. Okay, that really help a lot. So we've mocked that particular service. So we've mocked our user service, and now let's go ahead and describe our test suite. So we'll say user service, and this will take in a callback function. And then what we want to say is before each, so this will run this before every test. So what that should receive is that we want to do a yes, clear all mocks. So before we run every test, we want to clean our mock, which we have at the top there. And then once we do that, we then describe our test cases, and we say fetch. Now we want to do a fetch, right? Fetch users should return mocked data, right? And then this might not be given the best name for that. This should take in an async function, an async callback function, and we basically do a user service dot fetch users, and then we say dot mock. I think we're not using types for that, so we do a mock result value, and we say users. So what this does is that it creates a mock, and then we call this fetch users, and then we pass in the value. So this will basically resolve this particular mock function to return us a promise of the users, right? And then we now say const users fetched is equals to await, and then we call our user service, which basically is this user service here, and then we say dot fetch users, right? So this is our mock function here. This should call this mock here, and then this one should call this particular one here. That's basically what that will do. And then what you now do is that you do an expect, and then you say you expect the users fetch to have a length. So basically we expect that our value, or once we get that return list, we should get 2 items, right? So if let's close this, let's close this, let's close this, let's close this. If we get into data, we expect 2 items, which is an ID of 1 and ID 2, which is these 2 particular users. So that's what we're testing at this particular case here. So let's go ahead and run the test for that, and that passes, right? And then also if you notice, we had console logs here for creating connections to the DB, and that is related to our user model test, right? I forgot to mention that. So the next test we might want to write is that we get our users, and then we want to check something, right? So we say expect. So we expect our users fetched, right? And then we expect the first item, which is at index of 0.name .2b, and we expect that to be Bill, right? So we basically expect that once we fetch this list of users, first item, which is at index of 0, should be this, right? So if we do npm run test, this should fail, because it should say that we expect it to be Bill when we expect it to be Bill Diego. So let's copy this in, and let's replace this. And then let's run our test again, and that hopefully should pass. So yes, everything works perfectly. Now, there are a couple of other tests that I could run. Let me run the last one, and then I'll tell you what you should do as an assignment. So we expect users fetched to equal our list of users that we fetched. Okay, so we run that test, that should pass as well. I have a couple of tests that I wrote here, but because I don't want to make the video to be too long, I'll just tell you what to do. So what I would like you to do is I'd like you to write these particular test cases. Let me get rid of this, and then we paste this here. So I want you to write the test for this. So I want you to test that fetch user by ID should return a mock user, right? And you can perform some tests for that. The other test that I'd like you to look at is this particular use case. I'd like you to write another test where you test that the fetch user by ID should return undefined, which means you pass in an invalid user, okay? So I've decided to make the channel as informal as possible. The idea is that we should be able to relate with each other, and we should be able to write, be able to actually create good content, right? So yeah, this is going to be the end of the video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. So congratulations, you made it to the end of the video. I hope you did like the content, and if you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. If you'd like to stay up to date with new content that I do produce, don't forget to hit the notification button to stay up to date with new content. Until next time, stay blessed and in good health.